bright lights.
They are very bright.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
Good morning.
Welcome. Good morning. It's a privilege to welcome you all to this morning's General Assembly. I'm Sonia Kapadia. I am Deputy Director of Equal Justice Initiative, and I'm a trustee of the Aspen Institute. In my work with EJI, I've learned that democracy isn't sustained by laws and constitution alone. It depends on something deeper, our willingness to tell the truth, to see one another's humanity, and to believe that this experiment of democracy, though imperfect, should endure. Luckily, I have another copy here. I've come prepared. The connection between human flourishing and democratic vitality is core to the Aspen Institute's work as well, as you all very well know. As a trustee here, I'm continually reminded that democracy is fostered and renewed time and time again through dialogue, curiosity, and a shared commitment to asking difficult questions together. This morning, we are incredibly lucky to have some of the world's best thinkers on this topic of democracy. At a moment when democracies around the world are facing extraordinary pressures from polarization, technological change, declining trust, authoritarianism, we have this one question before us today. Is the democratic project in retreat, or is it preparing for its next chapter? To help us explore this question, we are very fortunate to be joined by one of the most thoughtful observers of global affairs. Please join me in welcoming my good friend and our moderator, Fareed Zakaria. And Fareed will take it away and introduce our incredible panel. We hope you enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Sonia is a dear friend, and I just want to highlight the devotion of her husband, Gaurav, who's in the front row here, who was busy taking iPhone video of every moment. See, even that moment, that American moment where the papers flew away, it has been caught. It's going to go viral on social media in a few moments. So be prepared for that, Sonia. Thank you guys for coming. It's such a pleasure to be able to get such a large audience for what is really an intellectual topic, but it is the heart, I think, of the problem of the question we face today. We have three extraordinary people, really. I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better set of people. Frank Fukuyama, I would argue, is probably the kind of leading public intellectual of my generation, certainly. Most famous for his book, concept article, The End of History, which we'll get to in a moment. Krista Freeland is an extraordinary person, one of the great journalists of the age, who then just decided she was going to take a brief detour and an excursion and become the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Foreign Minister, Trade Minister, Finance Minister. And we hope that that excursion is not done yet. And David French has had a very distinguished career in the world of action and in the world of ideas, and now sits at the New York Times as one of its leading columnists. And I think is one of those people who has had a very interesting intellectual journey as someone who thought of himself as a rock-ribbed conservative, only to discover that his party and his movement went in a very different, and I think he would say profoundly unconservative direction. Frank, you have had to spend 25 years explaining what the end of history means and what it doesn't mean. So let me give you a chance to tell us, whether we are now at the end of history. And what I mean by that is, what you were talking about when you wrote that famous essay was the idea that the great contestation of ideas between liberal democracy and its principal challengers which were communism, was over with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and liberal democracy had won, and in a sense, had won against all kinds of variations, monarchism, theological ideas about how to structure societies, and everyone had realized you kind of need some version of liberal democratic capitalism to survive in the modern world. Is it fair to say that while many people, every time there was a war or something bad would happen in the world, they'd say, oh, there you see, history has started up again, and you would patiently point out, no, 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 I meant history with a capital H. There's great contestation of ideas. But now, it is fair, I think, to say that there is at least substantial pressure on the idea that liberal democracy is the best form of government. Is there not?
Well, there certainly is, and it's very different from 35 years ago when that essay and the book were originally written. Although I would say, my idea of the end of history really had to do with what kind of society is likely to emerge at the end of a millennia-long modernization process. And there was a period when people thought there was a higher stage, which was Marxism, but that never happened, and that's really why I wrote the essay, because in 1989, it was clear that we were not going to move to this higher stage. So in many ways, since this is an Ideas Festival, question to ask is there actually an idea of a superior form of social and political economic organization than the kind of liberalism, liberal democracy that we've seen? And I have to say, there's certainly competitors. You have a Chinese model, you have an Iranian model, but which one of these is really likely to become universalized and seen as a substitute or a higher stage of human development? And I have not seen that in that period. However, you have real-world events, and there's no question that we're in a period of deep backsliding. However, I think that there's a reason to step back a little bit from the flow of events. We had the beginning of what our common mentor, Sam Huntington, labeled the third wave of democratization that began in the 1970s in Spain and Portugal, Turkey, so forth. A lot of countries began moving towards democracy. We went from about 35 democracies in the early 70s to over 100 by the early 21st century, and we've definitely been going backwards ever since. You've got the consolidation of Russia and China authoritarian systems that are clearly from the get-go not democratic. I think one of the most surprising developments is the growth of populist movements, above all in the United States, that have rejected certain institutional features, particularly the rule of law, in one of the countries that really established the rule of law and constitutional government as the norm. But I do think that it's helpful to take a longer-term historical view. We have been through setbacks to democracy before. We had the most serious one really in the 1930s and 40s with the rise of Stalinism and fascism. We had a lot of discouragement over democracy after the oil crises in the 1970s when people asked, can democracy survive? And I would say that the game is not over by any means, because there are good reasons why, for economic, political, social reasons, liberal democracy remains a system that is durable and sustainable in the way that authoritarian government is not. And we can get into this, but I do think that there's already signs of a turnaround in this 20-year backsliding that we've seen.
Let's talk for a moment, though, about the principal challenge that I think comes to liberal democracy now. And David French, you sort of come from that world. So it feels to me that the argument of the populist right is that this world that liberal democracy or liberalism has created, and I mean liberalism in the old-fashioned sense of Enlightenment liberalism, is too much a world of rules and constraints and elites and process, and that what you really need is the rule of strong men and strong gods. The idea, if you think about the tech bro Maoists, as I call them, right? The tech bro Maoists are saying this is all stuff for for the piddling, the kind of bureaucrats. What we need are these strong, larger-than-life figures who don't obey any of these constraints, and they just do stuff on the world. And we need to get back to that. We need to kind of revere and that is fundamentally at odds with the idea of liberal democracy, which is about checks and constraints, and people have rights, and you don't run roughshod over those. Is that, so tell us whether you think there is a coherent right-wing critique of this and where it's going.
Yeah, so if I was going to very briefly summarize sort of the populist right, the MAGA right, and what you would also include at its edges, the post-liberal right. In other words, the part of the right that doesn't love liberal democracy at all, who gets very angry when you hear words like America is a creedal country. They don't like that. They want America to be a country of blood and soil and heritage. And some will even use the term heritage American rather than just a normal, the word American isn't enough anymore. And here's how I'd put their case. And I'll do it in sort of two ways. Here's a sort of slogan you hear all the time on the right. Strong men make good times. Good times make weak men. Weak men make hard times. Strong men need to come back to restore from hard to good. And so you kind of have this history, this cycle throughout history. And then the other thing that they say is that one thing that small L liberalism does is it destroys through increased emphasis on individualism. This is a very big part of the attack. An increased emphasis on individualism leads also to civilizational weakness by degrading pre-liberal institutions. In other words, individualism degrades the family. Individualism degrades the church. Individualism degrades your bonds with civic associations. And they'd point to things like declining church attendance in the United States, the bowling alone phenomenon, where fewer people join together. And so as you hear this, some of your ears should be ticking like, oh yeah, there have been some degradation in some of these really important pre-liberal institutions. There has been degradation in the family. We have a lot more broken families than we used to. There has been very dramatically declining, although leveling off now, sort of church attendance. There has been a fracturing of sort of these civic associations and these civic bonds that are decaying. And so in many ways, a critic of liberalism is able to identify some legitimate problems that do exist. And then everything starts to fall apart as they start to pivot to, okay, now what? And when they're pivoting to the okay, now what, is when we start walking through the museum of wretched ideas. Because we're not talking about the revival, or we're not talking about the invention of new and interesting ideologies to combat liberal democracy. We're talking about the revival of ancient hatreds and authoritarianisms. So you're seeing on the young right, rising interest in fascism. 34% or so of young Americans express some affection for communism. You're seeing tariffs? Yeah, tariffs, that's a great idea, never been tried. And then sort of this, and sort of the most malignant thing is this rising anti-Semitism, which is tapping into some of these ancient hatreds and ancient maladies of authoritarianism. And then, oh yeah, we've got a guy going for a land war in Europe. That works out really well for all of us. And so again and again and again, they're turning to these dark ideas. And this is where I think, I could be totally wrong about this, but I'm going to throw in a dash of optimism. I think as we will look back on the high water mark of this current wave of authoritarianism as occurring around, I don't know, coincidentally, November 2024, because that was the great triumph of the populist right in the US. And this was also a time where in Europe, you still had Viktor Orban in power, and you had Putin slowly, steadily marching westward across Ukraine. And I'll stop filibustering in half a second. But what is it that helped turn the tide, I think, between November 2024 and now? Two things. One, you see more fully how bankrupt this new right is, and people are recoiling from it. And number two, quite frankly, there's just been a lot of courage and conviction shown by defenders of liberal democracy, both in the battlefield in Ukraine. Sometimes liberal democracies have got to win wars to preserve democracy. And then also, we have seen an enormous amount of courage in the streets and the courtrooms across the United States of America as people are saying no.
I want to go back to the Museum of Bad Ideas, because that's a wonderful phrase. And it resonates because sometimes you listen to some of this post-liberal right, and as you said, they say some important things about the weakness of family structures and community structures. But then they don't, they don't really tell you what they want to propose in return, because they know it would be deeply unpopular. So they hint at the idea of undoing no-fault divorce, right? Because when you say, well, people are getting divorced too much, what can you do about that? Well, they say, well, we went to a no-fault divorce system, and that's terrible. So are you going to undo? Are you really going to go back to the 1930s and 40s when people were trapped in unhappy marriages? Or they'll say, gay rights has gone too far. Well, what do you exactly want to do? Do you want to allow systematic discrimination of people on the basis of sexual orientation? I want to ask you, Krista, how do you view this cultural backlash? And is some of it just, an inevitable reaction to things like the emancipation of women?
It is definitely a backlash, but I want to pick up on something that both David and Frank said, and I want to make a prediction which is falsifiable, which is I think that we're going to look back on the spring of 2026 as the turning point when liberal democracy around the world started to fight back and successfully win. And it's, I think we will. I think Minneapolis is really important. I think Orban's defeat in Hungary is really important. And I think the most important thing is Ukraine. And Ukraine is important partly, Fareed, because it's a counterpoint to exactly that idea. I mean, I should also put my cards on the table. I am an economic advisor to President Zelensky. It's an unpaid volunteer role, but it's a formal one. So I've picked a side. But what I think is important to understand about Ukraine's battlefield success is, the fight between authoritarianism and liberal democracy in Ukraine, it's not rhetorical. It's not about who has the best memes or the cutest talking points. It's about who lives and who dies, and who wins and who loses. And what's remarkable about Ukraine is they are actually winning because they are a multicultural, decentralized, feminist democracy. And but it's actually true. Like, I'm not making it up. It's actually true. And that the whole kind of Hegseth sort of vision of the white Christian male warrior and lethality, that is what Putin tried to project. And, maybe it looked okay when it was just ads on TV. But the reality is Ukraine is winning precisely because it stands against all of that. So why is the war effort so successful? Because Ukraine is a decentralized democracy. Ukraine has turned out to be so good at military technology because the procurement and the production of weapons is not done in a centralized way. It's done at the battalion level, quite literally by communities of people getting together and deciding to make drones. Firepoint, which is one of the big military tech companies producing the Flamingo missiles that have been doing deep strikes into Russia, has a woman CEO who is in her 30s, mother of two, the CEO of Rheinmetall, a big German arms company, was asked about this in an interview, and he said, the Ukrainians, they're not that good at making weapons. Their weapons are being made by housewives in their kitchens with 3D printers. And so Ira now, when she speaks on panels, she says, hi, I'm a housewife who makes drones. And so it's really this utterly decentralized. Ukraine now has the greatest number of women actually in combat positions. There are 70,000 Ukrainian women fighting in combat positions. But for them, it's not a culture war thing. For them, it is about being a democracy and everyone pitching in and everyone doing what they can do to be free. It reminds me very much of the self-organization that we saw in Minneapolis. And I think, we've been so besieged by this sort of imagery, this mythology of, the way to be strong is the strong men who come to rescue us from hard times. But when you look at what actually works, it turned out that Frank Fukuyama is right. What actually works is democracy. And people who want to be free, who trust their neighbors, getting together, being smart and ingenious, and fighting back. And I think, if the Ukrainians can do it, I think the rest of us should be able to do it too.
So because I'm the moderator and we do not have a MAGA representative on the panel, I'm going to push back.
You're going to be our MAGA representative?
I'm going to be your devil's advocate. Frank, in your book, The End of History and The Last Man, and people forget that phrase, you very presciently said, the end of history could end up being a very boring time for a lot of people because human beings have this urge for, to have something larger than themselves that they can feel passionate about, that they feel like it represents some kind of irrational, tribal, or thematic impulse in them. And you predicted that there would be some such urge that comes up. And I would argue that that is one of the problems with liberalism, right? Liberal democracy says, we are not going to tell you what the meaning of life is. The church used to tell you that. The commissars of the Communist Party used to tell that. What we're telling you is you decide what the definition of a good life is, what the pursuit of happiness is. And it turns out that frightens a lot of people. That makes people, it at least unnerves them, and they say, no, I'd much rather consult the Talmud, the Bible, the Quran. I don't want to have to make this decision. And that is what the right has preyed on, this idea that, no, you should not be making it. We will tell you, tradition, God, country, those are the words that J.D. Vance uses, that Orban uses. Is that not a kind of weakness of liberalism?
Yeah, so this is the problem of the last man. This is the creature that Friedrich Nietzsche said would emerge at the end of history. Basically, somebody content with peace, prosperity, security, with no higher ideals, no striving, and nothing that they would die for. And I think that that actually is a problem in a contemporary world where our society does not ask for that level of sacrifice for anything. And I think there's a certain aspiration to a kind of transcendence of one's, day-to-day life that people strive for. They want to be seen as noble, as doing something great, and the society doesn't provide that many opportunities. And I think that explains a lot of the extremism. So, after October 7th, we had encampments in many universities, including my own at Stanford. So why are these kids sitting out in tents, for 6 months? And I think it gets back to this issue, right, that the only striving they've done is to get into Stanford, right? But they're not, being asked to call for a higher level of sacrifice on behalf of a cause like, noble cause like social justice. And so they want to sit in tents because that's something that's missing in their lives. And, these cosplaying guys on January 6th that were dressed up in camouflage and, they would have carried AK-47s if they'd had the opportunity. Right. They're doing exactly the same thing. They want to be like those founding fathers that sacrificed, their sacred honor for the sake of preserving the country, except that there was no country that needed preserving at that point, right?
Right.
So
it's a search for a cause larger than yourself. And I think, the point Krista was making so eloquently, I would add to it just one thing, which is the Ukrainians are so effective because they deeply believe in what they are fighting for. They deeply believe, it's if you want to understand why liberal democracy is worth preserving, look at the people who are willing to die for it, right? When you are deprived of it, you realize how valuable it is, and you're willing to fight and die for it, as the West did in World War II, as the Ukrainians are doing now. But when you have it, it becomes easy. And David, I want to ask you, you say that a lot of our problem is amnesia, that we're living at a time when no one remembers, outside of Ukraine, that these ideas and ideals were actually once contested.
Well, I wrote a column where I used two quotes, famous historical quotes that are so commonly quoted, they're almost like cliches, but we need to remember them and think about them and absorb them. And one of them is Winston Churchill's famous statement that democracy is the worst system of the world except for every other one, okay? And what we have, though, if you're looking at the encampments, basically everyone older, millennial, and younger is growing up, especially in the United States of America, with an exposure to the worst system of the world, our democracy, and no real exposure to every other one, right? So they don't remember Soviet domination. They don't remember fascist authoritarianism. That's all in history books that they did not read, okay? And so you're in a world in which people are experiencing real flaws in democracy. And this is one thing that I wish, I've been a part of a lot of defend democracy gatherings. One of the things we have to do as those who defend democracy, we're never going to perfect it, but we got to keep working on it. And we got to keep showing a lot of these folks that a lot of their concerns are quite legitimate. And number two, we have to replace a bad vision with a better vision. And who was very keenly aware of this was the founders. So the founders knew that a lot of what we were trying to do with this democracy was kind of against human nature. A lot of us have this will to power, this will to dominate, this will to control. And so a lot of the struggle that should give us purpose is actually a personal struggle towards virtue and against the will to power. And the founders saw that struggle towards virtue, towards loving your neighbor, for example. One of the most, George Washington's favorite Bible verses was Micah 4:4. He used it more than 50 times in his writing to describe our new republic. He said, "Every man shall sit under his own vine and own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid." In other words, the struggle was to extend the sphere of this republic. And so what we have to do is not to try to deprive young people of this burning sense of purpose. We have to show the way of what virtuous purpose looks like. And for people of faith, we have to be able to tell them and to show them that liberal democracy in many ways is the best place for you. So I am a white Southern conservative evangelical. Until recently, my neighborhood was 85% MAGA. So I have heard the case for Trump ad infinitum. And I cannot tell you how much part of the case for right-wing authoritarianism is this argument that liberal democracy is somehow inherently hostile to traditional expressions of faith. Well, I'm a walking, living, breathing traditional expression of faith. I'm theologically conservative, I'm politically conservative, and I know the absolutely best place for a theologically conservative person in the world is a liberal democracy. Because if you're not in one, you better be running the place because you're in real trouble, okay? And I know there's not enough of me to run any place. And so I am a zealous defender of liberty and the liberty of others in part because I believe in loving my neighbor, and one of the ways of loving your neighbor is to extend to them the same liberties that you would want for yourself. But also, I'm self-interested. I defend liberty because I enjoy it. I like it. It's a good thing. And so we have to be able to make the case to young people who are struggling and who seek purpose, have I got the purpose for you? It's just different from the one you're pursuing now, but it's better, it's richer, and it will provide you with meaning your entire life.
Yeah, it's it's a wonderful way to describe it in terms of what a theologically conservative person would want. It reminds me, sometimes I have over the course of my career many times praised Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew's creation and handling of Singapore, and people say to me, does that mean you like authoritarian regimes? I said, I like authoritarian regimes if you can allow me to pick the dictator. If you guarantee me I'll get Lee Kuan Yew, I'm all for it. But the problem is the chances are I'm going to get Marcos or Mobutu or any one of the cavalcade of horrendous dictators, and there's no way to guarantee that you get the person of virtue. I want to ask about a place where liberalism, centrist liberalism, has succeeded, Canada. Now, I think we don't give enough credit to Canada, right? Even we've been celebrating the Declaration of Independence, 250th anniversary of it, the American Revolution, and we see this as our great ability and effort to create the most amazing society in the history of the world, which I totally believe in as an immigrant. But I do notice there's this other place up north that didn't rebel against the British Empire, that had no Declaration of Independence. It's kind of turned out okay, right? Like, Canada doesn't seem like a case study in some horrendous, dystopian version of what would have happened had we not had the Declaration of Independence, which always, tempers my sense of celebration about all of it. And I notice now that Canada is ruled by, in fact, has been ruled by two centrist liberals for the last almost dozen years. Why are you guys not succumbing to this kind of right-wing populist wave that seems to be sweeping the rest of the world?
The immediate answer is Donald Trump. Pierre Trudeau, previous prime minister, had this great line about being Canada and the United States. And he said, being your neighbor is like sleeping with an elephant. Even if the elephant is very well behaved, you're very aware of every tremor and every wiggle by the elephant. So we're very aware as a country of what happens in the United States. And the re-election of Donald Trump in 2024 made Canadians absolutely believers in liberal democracy, and really made us recognize that it's an existential crisis for us, and we had to be united, and we had to be united behind a party, my party actually called the Liberal Party. And that's not new for us. Canada actually exists as a response to US manifest destiny. So when your Civil War was over, Canada was not yet a country. And our own fathers of Confederation looked south. The victorious Union Army was the biggest army in the world, and they said, uh-oh, we may have a problem. And that's when they came together in Charlottetown, and we decided to form of the British provinces to become a country, because manifest destiny was becoming an idea in the United States, and we felt we had to come together. What I will say, though, is, and this is kind of a plea, because we're here in the United States. I bet most people here are American. This is sort of a plea to Americans and to America. A thing that worries me very much about my country, and that I see in all of your traditional allies, your NATO allies, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, is people are starting to give up on the United States. And we're starting to think that we, as liberal democracies, committed to liberal democracy in our own country, we need to start planning for a world in which you will not be committed to liberal democracy, in which we can't rely on you as an ally or a partner. I think it's prudent for us to be planning in that way, but I think it's a really, really suboptimal outcome for us. And I would urge Americans, as you think about liberal democracy fighting back, don't just think about doing it in your own country. Think about how you are going to restore America's place as a leader of the global alliance of liberal democracies. And I say that because it's better for the rest of us if you do that, but it's better for you too. And it's going to be harder than you think. There's a latent anti-Americanism among your traditional allies, and you've done quite a lot to feed it.
What?
I have to say. And like, it's a big deal. Like in my, I live in Toronto, and we have, there used to be a provincial monopoly on the sale of alcohol. We're like a very kind of traditional culture in many ways. So we have something called the Liquor Control Board of Ontario. It's the main seller of booze, and they don't sell any American alcohol. And there's a big sign on the doors saying, "For love of Canada, we will not sell any American products here." That's how people are feeling. But what really worries me about, someone rather presciently wrote a book called The Post-American World. What really worries me about a post-American world is if America is not on the side of liberal democracy and leading that fight, the rest of us are going to be engaged in a balancing act with China. We haven't talked about China here, but I think that the real challenge to liberal democracy is not the MAGA model. I don't think that actually works very well economically. It's the China model. And if we don't have an America which is a strong liberal democracy at home, a strong and generous ally of its liberal democratic partners around the world, China is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger and going to make more and more inroads into our own countries. And one day we may wake up and actually say, yeah, history ended, and it's Chinese state capitalism that has won. And I think that would be a terrible outcome. So please, get your house in order, American neighbors.
So let's talk about less successful liberal democracies, because we are also living through a period where Britain has now once more turned over its prime minister. I think they've now had 7 in the last 5 years or something like that. If you look at what is happening in France, where the president basically cannot get through any part of his agenda. If you look at Germany, where the Friedrich Merz, the chancellor, is, I think, at a 20% approval rating. And of course, you look at the United States, which is pretty dysfunctional. Why is it that most Western democracies seem to be stuck in this crisis of governance? And we've talked about it for a while. People have come up with, why is it that it seems impossible to do anything other than talk about it? Why does it not seem to get better?
So I think that every country has its own explanation, and Britain is, if it hadn't left the European Union, I don't think they'd be in nearly as bad a situation as they are now. However, I do think that there is something common across liberal democracies, which is its inability to get things done, to build things. And the reason for that is actually kind of intrinsic in liberalism. Liberalism is about the rule of law, but many liberal countries have too many laws. If you look at, for example, if you're a government agency in the United States and you want to buy an office desk, you have to buy it under something called the Federal Acquisition Regulations, which is thousands of pages of rules about how you buy an office desk, right? And I think that you've seen a repeated failure of centrist politicians to actually deliver things because of their inability to get past, this mountain of rules that they face. And that's what creates the demand for, these strong men that were mentioned earlier. David mentioned that want to simply abolish all rules and get things done. And I do think that it's an urgent matter that we stay within the rule of law, but we dramatically simplify the way we come to common decision. I say this as a resident of California, where I think this burden of rules is just so evident everywhere. We voted for high-speed rail sometime in the mid-1990s, and I think they built like 10 miles of track, in Fresno or someplace. It's just not happening. And there are comparable instances, Germany. In Germany, they have this project called Stuttgart 21. So the city of Stuttgart in Baden-Württemberg was supposed to be a high-speed rail terminal for a trans-European high-speed rail system that would go from Paris to Vienna. They planned this thing beginning before German unification, and it's still not been built. Right? And so I think that there is, this is the one part of the conservative critique that I take seriously. You need the rule of law. You do not want to create a situation where you have a Trump or an Elon Musk that simply says, let's just forget about law, just do what we want. But law is a real problem. I mean, it is a real constraint. It leads to something that I call vetocracy, meaning rule by veto, where in many of our countries, we have so many players in the political system who can stop something from happening. And we don't delegate authority in a way that actually allows us to do things like build infrastructure. We've got this huge housing crisis, and it's happening in blue cities primarily. And the reason is it's just too hard to build this stuff because of this burden of rules. So I think that, there is something in common. I would be the last person to say this explains, Merz and Macron and Starmer and all these people, but I do think that there is a common problem that is experienced by many liberal democracies today.
So, Krista, as a practicing politician, I think that I would extend the critique one step beyond what Frank was saying, because it's not just that we find ourselves with these rules and regulations. I would argue that the left has been captured by a whole set of groups and institutions and unions that have demanded these rules and still demand them. And that's why it's very hard to just get rid of them. It seems so obvious to do what Frank is saying, get rid of all these rules, but you would have howls of outrage and you would lose endorsements and So there's a real problem on the left where it is beholden to a whole vast kind of apparatus that stops this from happening. I wanted to hear your thoughts on it. And again, why has Canada not been fallen prey to this as much?
No, I think it's a problem in Canada too. I mean, when I was finance minister, and this is in a liberal, so sort of, center-left government, we actually built a pipeline. And I was the minister responsible for getting it done. And I'm really proud that we did that. And that was something that was definitely went against the views of a lot of our own voters. But we felt it was important because we needed, it's a pipeline going to BC to the West Coast. It helped us to diversify our energy exports and be less dependent on the United States, which after your election in 2024, we're kind of happy about. But one of the things that I sort of really directly experienced as being in charge of getting this pipeline built was exactly what Frank has been talking about. Just there was one instance where the pipeline was going through a field and there turned out to be a bird's nest there. And this caused a delay in the building that increased the cost by tens of millions of dollars. So, we are not immune to it. And I think your point, Frida, is a really important one because, it's very easy at a high level to say, let's have an abundance agenda and let's get rid of all these regulations. But they weren't put in place for no reason. And usually they were put in place for good reasons. Each one had a good reason. You know, we want to protect birds. We want to protect the historic character of neighborhoods. You know, Jane Jacobs, she kind of had a point, et cetera, et cetera. But when you have the accretion of all of those rules, it does, I absolutely agree, it does mean that liberal democracies can struggle to do things quickly enough. And the only thing I would add, you know, to I think Frank's really good point is it's also harder to be a small L liberal politician pushing things through than a right-wing populist politician pushing things through. Your constituency gives you less room to maneuver. And one of the things that I think we collectively need to do, like if we believe in liberal democracy, and this is, I think I can say this without sounding self-serving because I'm not a politician right now, but we need to give our liberal leaders a little bit more leeway to actually get stuff done. If that's what we want them to do, give them a little bit of runway to do it.
David, this sort of gets at a question that I've wondered what your reaction to would be. So you do have a bunch of Republicans who do get stuff done. I mean, Ron DeSantis actually runs Florida quite well. If you look at Texas, they are able to build, they have built more solar and wind than California without any subsidies, any preferential treatment, just because it's so damn easy to build anything in Texas, right? And so you can get pipelines, you can get whatever you need, wind farms. Is this the sign of a kind of post-Trump MAGA right? And what do you think of it as a conservative? Would you be comfortable with many of these governors who obviously are paying a certain amount of fealty to the personality cult of Trump right now, but who at their core seem to be more responding to the Chrysler Freeland and Frank Fukuyama critique that they do get stuff done?
Well, I think it's very important to draw a distinction between the National Republican Party, which is, it's hard for me to find a lot of hope there, just to be honest. The level of sycophancy that is necessary to function, and one of the things that is very illustrative to me is look at the Republican senators who've lost their primaries. And now they're like unleashed, right? Could you have done it 5 minutes before? I mean, you know, if you're doomed anyway, you could have kept a lot more of that dignity and leadership. But the National Republican Party is existing completely in the solar eclipse of Donald Trump. The state Republican parties are handling things different state by state, but many of them are doing quite innovative things. So, for example, the Mississippi Miracle in reading is something that every state should be looking at. But a lot of people will not look at it because it's Mississippi and because it's a red state and it's going to be MAGA coded and all of this. And it reminds me of this, oh gosh, I'm just blanking on who originated it, but there's this problem called the Fox News fallacy. And that is, if it's on Fox News, it's got to be wrong, right? And so often that will leave a lot of more left-leaning American citizens to be not aware of actual problems. So it was way too late before the center-left got aware of what was going on at the border. That by the time everyone realized that, it was too late. And part of it was because if something was coming, a critique was coming from the right, people were dismissing it. And they're often sometimes dismissing solutions if they come from the right because they're MAGA tainted because they're coming from Republicans. So we have to be open to solutions from interesting places and from people with whom you have disagreements. We have to be open to that. And the one thing that I would say about democracy that I do think is a common thread overseas and here is a lot of the problem with our current liberal democracies is they don't have as much democracy as they should. So a perfect example is here in the United States. we're a closely divided country. We're going into what might be a wave election season where right now, if you look at the Cook Political Report, less than 10% of House races are competitive. And that's because what we have is essentially a minority rule dynamic in many parts. It's sort of looking globally at the United States of America, where you have an exhausted majority that is often sort of sees itself as outside of the system. And then two highly motivated wings who have captured the parties almost completely and then engineer everything to their continued rule and power, most principally through gerrymandering. So that, think about this, guys. 80% of us live in one-party states, where it's a trifecta, all blue or all red, and it's about evenly divided, 39% in blue trifecta states, 41% in red trifecta. Of the remaining 19-point-something%, most of us live in single-party districts. So we can't think of America as having a two-party system anymore. It has two one-party systems. And one-party systems are almost always going to be deeply flawed. So we're getting almost like none of the benefits of the two-party system and all of the maladies of the one-party system being channeled through two highly polarized, separating regions of the United States of America. So when I say what are some of the problems with liberal democracy right now, one of the answers is not enough democracy.
Yeah. And that is a peculiarly American problem. You know, at this point, I believe that it is true that the turnover of people in the House of Representatives is lower in America today than it was in the Supreme Soviet in the 1980s. Do we have mics for questions? Can I ask, get people's reactions or questions? Do people have, are there mic runners out there? Sir, yeah. But can you just wait for the mic? Yeah, thank you so much. And if you can just be brief and make sure there's a question mark at the end of what you were saying.
David, what you said was so important. Do you think open primaries are part of the solution?
That's a great question. What was, he said, are open primaries part of the solution? I think open primaries are part of the solution. I'm very interested in ranked choice voting, for example, to diminish the power of the wings. But you know what? Let me give you my favorite solution right now to help restore American democracy. Hang with me here. Expand the House. Make it more representative. Make it more, if you expand the House, let's just say you triple the size of the House to make it exactly the same ratio of citizens to representatives that was about when the House was last expanded around 100 years ago. Same districts, 3 representatives per district, top 3 vote getters. All of a sudden, you can't have any more a situation like we have in Tennessee, which is now being gerrymandered. That's where I'm from, 9-0 in a 60-40 state. So this is a crisis of democracy right there. So I strongly believe in expanding the House. I strongly believe in ranked choice voting and or multi-member districts to try to increase American representation. And we need to get creative. I taught a class called 5 constitutional amendments to save America. And we have to be looking with one hand, we're hanging on by our fingernails to this constitutional republic. But on the other hand, we got to be thinking creatively. Once we break this logjam, just like in great reform movements in the after American crises in the past, like the second founding after the Civil War, the legal reform after Watergate, we need to be thinking about reform so that this doesn't happen again.
I think there's a way to get Donald Trump interested in this, because if you expand the House, it's a huge building project. Right? Imagine the amount of gold you can put in the new House of Representatives chamber. Ma'am, at the end, yeah.
Given that we want to stop the war against each other, do you think it would inflame the situation more if you expand the Supreme Court? What is a creative idea to help it? What do you have in Canada? Do you have limits?
Every other country in the world has some kind of limitation on the highest court. Frank, you want to take that?
Well,
Krista, maybe as a Canadian?
Yeah, no, you have our justices have to retire at 75.
And they're chosen in a more nonpartisan way, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, there is a body that recommends to the prime minister who the next justice should be. But I think maybe something that will give you a sense of how it's very much not as partisan as it is here is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, who was appointed to that position by Justin Trudeau, was appointed as a justice by Stephen Harper. So we don't really have this idea of a conservative and liberal judges. And it's really too bad that you do.
Yeah. I mean, this is something Ken Burns pointed out yesterday. We were talking about how right after the Constitution is founded, you have 10 amendments to it. The founders very much understood that this was a working document, that this was something that had to be perfected. We have not had a constitutional amendment in the United States for 50 years. Yeah. And I think it's fair to say it's difficult to imagine, and certainly in the next 20 years. So ask yourself, is it really, I mean, yes, the founding fathers were smart, but are they that smart that, well, they could imagine?
Super fast on that point. Here's a constitutional amendment. Amend the Constitution to make it easier to amend the Constitution. Here's another one. Term limits for Supreme Court justices, 18-year terms, selected first and third year of every president's term, so that we have a degree of certainty and an increased sense of democratic participation.
And my favorite, get rid of the presidential pardon, which makes absolutely no sense. It is a royal prerogative that just allows you to whimsically, remove people from consequences of justice. It makes no sense. Ma'am, at the back there.
Well, the media might not like this idea, but should we reduce the amount of time that we have elections and the amount of money that is allowed to be spent on elections?
Frank, what do you think about the role of money? Again, we're unique. Almost every other liberal democracy has pretty tight limits on it.
Yeah, well, Buckley versus Vallejo and then Citizens United, I think were total disasters. I mean, the idea that money is speech in an era when you have one single individual that is worth $1 trillion and his speech is going to be the equal of every other citizen in the country just doesn't work. So that's one of the things that I think really needs to be walked back in some manner, because you're right, virtually every other liberal democracy has limits on campaign finance, and I don't see why our Constitution should prohibit that.
Yeah, I think when we set up the democracy in Iraq, for what it's worth, I think it has very tight limits on campaign finance. So it's like we want it for other people, just not for ourselves. Sir, yeah. There's always the danger that you respond to somebody. I used to do this when I was teaching as a grad student at Harvard. I would, the people who are asking seem very urgent and excited, and it tends to always be the men. And so you over-represent in asking. So I'm hoping your question is urgent and important, because your hand was up in a very, very enthusiastic way.
My name is Hamed. I cover foreign policy for Notice. My question is actually very important, but this is not about America or the West. My question is about whether or not we could still have hope to establish liberal democracy in countries in the Middle East or my country, Afghanistan. We had a taste of democracy in the past 20 years when the US came to our country, and then they fell apart in a day. Has America given up on establishing democracy in that particular region of the world? Should we have hope?
Frank, why don't you take this on? Because this was actually your original area of academic expertise. Yeah.
So we've given up on creating democracy around the world, period. I mean, it's just not part of this administration's agenda. As somebody that was on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy for 18 years, I think that was just a terrible turn in policy. Now, when you look at a specific area like the Middle East, back at the time of the Iraq War, we had this very kind of polarized view. Some people said, well, culturally, you can't establish democracy in a Muslim-majority country. And then you had people like Condi Rice saying, no, that's ridiculous. There are no cultural constraints. I think the truth of the matter is somewhere in between. It would be absurd to say that culture makes no difference in terms of the ability to create a democracy. In Eastern Europe, you didn't have the equivalent of radical Islamist parties that were contesting elections. But I think that you can give too much weight to culture, and you can understand that culture evolves over time, and that it's very possible for a desire for greater participation to arise from within the society. One thing that's going on in that region, they are educating, not in Afghanistan, but throughout the Gulf, they are educating more women than men. The ratio of women to men in universities in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, and so forth, in Iran, it's over 50%. And I just don't see how a society that educates that number of women is going to remain as patriarchal and authoritarian as it has. So I think that there's a social basis for some important changes coming in that region.
So we end on that optimistic note that women will save us.